Hello, everyone, and welcome to another weekly walk. And of course, it's great to see you all here today. Thanks again for joining us on this edition of the walk. Now, today in our program, we're going to dive deep into the history books, and we're going to take a look at the indigenous history of Central Park. So that means that we're going to examine the role that Native Americans have had in shaping the landscape of the park for the past maybe hundreds, if not thousands, of years. So as such, we'll focus mostly on the Lenape groups that historically have lived in the local area, and of course, still very much call New York City home. All right, so again, before we begin, let's go over the Zoom control functions. And as you all know, all participants are muted, but you can use the chat feature to say hello and comment. If you'd like to ask any questions, you can use the Q&A function. And my colleague Carla is on the back end. She's going to answer any inquiries you folks might have. Now, the images that you'll see today were taken from a variety of different sources, including the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, and other historic archives. And of course, our mission here at the Conservancy is to preserve and celebrate Central Park as a sanctuary from the pace and pressures of city life, enhancing the enjoyment and well-being of all. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the map of our route for today. So we're going to start off at the north shore of the Harlem Mere, and then we're going to work our way down the east side of the water. We're going to take a close look at Fort Clinton and Fort Fish before ending off at the North Woods, so right by the Ravine Waterfall. And of course, along the way, we'll get to learn all about the Lenape that called this place home. Okay, so let's first discuss the basics. And I think before anything else, we really should try to answer the main question of who exactly were the Lenape. The Lenape were not just one group or tribe of people. They're actually a collection of folks that spoke many different languages and dialects, and they lived in what is now the Northeast United States. The land that they lived in was called Lenapehoking. And Lenapehoking actually stretched from the lower Hudson Valley all the way down to Delaware. So Lenapehoking pretty much included all of New York City, Philadelphia, and of course, the areas in between, including much of New Jersey. They spoke one of several different languages within the Algonquin language family. And within Algonquin was a language called Munsee. Now, Munsee was the main variety that was spoken here in New York, but of course, you also had other dialects and sub-languages as well. So as you folks can see, the Lenape had a very large footprint that spanned several modern-day states. So let's examine the New York City area a little bit closer and see what lays in store for us. So this map in front of us, this is believed to be one of the oldest maps of Manhattan Island. And it was actually based off of a 1639 map by a Dutch cartographer. The land that would become Central Park itself, which actually I've highlighted here on the map, it didn't really have any permanent habitation sites for the Lenape, but it was used as a hunting ground by at least 3 different bands of the indigenous groups. So to the north, you can find the Wecquaesgeek people, who were based up in the Western Bronx, and they came down to Manhattan Island in the summer months when food was plentiful. To the east and northeast were the Rechgawawunk people. They had a campsite nearby, and I'll speak a little bit more about that later on. The southern parts of the island were the hunting grounds of the Mannahattas, and they were based primarily in Long Island. All right, so here we are at the Harlem Mere right now, and beyond the water, of course, the topography becomes a little bit more hilly and forested, almost as if it was left undisturbed by the encroachment of the city. So, of course, today we all know that you can go hiking here, you can go birding, perhaps maybe you can admire all the different trees and plantings. So with this bucolic landscape in front of us, they think this is the perfect area to now start off our examination of Central Park's native history. So here's a view of the Mere from the other side of the water. Now, over the last few decades, the Conservancy really has been stepping up efforts to make the shoreline more reminiscent of the state of New York's natural wetlands. So while walking around here, you might see plantings like reeds, trees, and the occasional shrub, all of which were likely present here in the same exact spot before the 1600s. Now, here's a map of the northeast corner of the park back in the 1860s, and a couple of things you might notice here. So first of all, the Harlem Mere hasn't actually been constructed just yet, but this is where it would be located. So even though the Mere's bucolic qualities might suggest that it's been here forever, it actually wasn't. It was, of course, designed as part of the Queen's Warren Plan, which, of course, we all know by now. Now, you'll also see a few streams and creeks which meet right here, right where the mere would be. Now, before Harlem Mere was built, you might have actually seen a swamp from all these waterways coming together in the same exact spot, which is basically a low-lying area located at the foot of the hills just off towards the south. So here is actually an image of a typical red maple swamp. Now, this one is not actually in Central Park. In fact, it's not even in New York City. This is actually upstate in Rensselaer County. Now, wetlands like these are increasingly rare in New York City, especially in the 21st century, but you'll still find them in a lot more rural areas of the state. So this view that we're looking at right now probably might be similar to what certain parts of Manhattan Island might have looked like back in the 1600s, like up here in Harlem. Now, these swamps and marshes contain a diversity of wildlife that were important to both native people and settlers from Europe. Now, back then, there would have been at least 20 freshwater ponds and more than 66 miles of streams in Manhattan. And they were home to wildlife like fish, frogs, turtles, ducks, and yes, even beavers, among many, many other things. Now, the bounties of the land, of course, provided the Lenape with the food and the resources that they needed. So, as you might expect, they caught lots of fish, including things like shad, herring, salmon, and sturgeon, all of which are very, very large fish, and of course, provided enough protein to feed the whole entire family. In winter, they would have actually eaten up any dried fish that were prepared over the previous months. So they did have plenty of food for the entirety of the year. They also hunted, of course, for a variety of other wildlife like beavers, deer, and even oysters, all of which were very, very plentiful in and around the waters of Manhattan Island. Okay, so let's continue on with the walk. And from the Harlem Mere, we're going to head southwest and we're going to explore the hills and valleys of this rocky section of the park. We're going to follow the path towards the right, up towards the steps into Fort Clinton. Now, once we make it to the top of the steps, we're greeted by this very old ship's cannon that's currently on display. Now, both the cannon and the name Fort Clinton is actually a reference to this hill's very important history as a military vantage point. Today, the views from Fort Clinton are just as incredible, and they really allow park visitors to take in the cityscape from all directions. Now, it was these same breathtaking views that made this hill such an important site for the military. For the Lenape that occupied this land hundreds of years prior, their views would have been one of forests. They would have seen hills, dales, valleys, and of course, plenty of streams and ponds in between. Now, towards the southeast, we might have actually seen a Lenape encampment here. And as you folks can see on the map, it was actually called Konandekong. Now, this was a relatively this was a relatively small settlement, and it had no more than 200 inhabitants at any given point in time. This was actually occupied by the Rutgawawunk band, who lived here in the summer, but they also had winter encampments up towards the north, especially closer towards the Bronx River. You also might have found other Lenape groups throughout the island. So a relatively large one could be found in what's today Marble Hill, basically at the northern tip of Manhattan. That one was occupied by the Wekwazy people. All the way down towards the Battery at the south end of the island was the village of Manatos, and that would later become a part of New Amsterdam in the 1620s and 1630s. Now, these habitation sites were, of course, pretty small, and they only had a few families living in each camp. Generally, especially for these smaller sites, people lived in these structures called wigwams. Essentially, these were tents that were made from parts of trees. So the tent poles, quote unquote, as we might call them, they were actually made by stitching together young tree saplings into a dome shape. So you can actually see where those tree saplings are. The saplings were then covered over in the bark of mature trees like the American elm, which was pliable, but it was also heavy enough to protect them from the elements. Now, each wigwam had a space for a small-sized family. and also had an opening at the top to allow for a campfire during colder nights. Now, wigwams provide great protection in milder weather, but in the winter, when the bitter cold winds ravage through the entire harbor, the Lenape needed housing that was much more conducive to the climate. So in that case, they lived in these long houses that were located in more protected areas away from the winds. So places like the Bronx, which is a little bit more inland. So longhouses were constructed of similar materials to the wigwams, but they had more insulation and they could hold a lot more people. In fact, several families could sometimes be found living in each longhouse, which was especially active in wintertime when people rarely left the safety of the camps. All right, so continuing on from Fort Clinton, we're going to continue meandering along the park pathways. So right ahead of us, you can see this junction of trails that basically meet right here in this small valley in between two rock outcrops. Now, this might not look very interesting at all today in the 21st century, but along this area of the park, this is actually the site of a War of 1812 era gatehouse through which one of the most important roadways in early New York ran. So this is what that gatehouse looked like. And the gatehouse was constructed by the American military for the War of 1812. And it was supposed to defend New York City from any potential British attacks that might come in from the north. Essentially, it acted as a security checkpoint, and it was, of course, vital in New York's defense. So note the troops with their muskets and cannon keeping a close eye out on things. Now, Kingsbridge Road was present in maps by the time of the American Revolution, and it served as the main throughway for people traveling between New York City and New England. Now, as a major thoroughfare, Kingsbridge Road was initially constructed over the existing pathway of the Lenape Trail that was once called the Wecquaesgeek Road. And the Wecquaesgeek Road, which winded through the island's many hills and valleys, connected various native settlements together. Today, we know portions of this trail as Broadway, 3rd Avenue, and St. Nicholas Avenue. So there's still that connection to the modern day urban streetscape of New York. All right, and continuing on with our walk. And let's keep walking towards the southwest, and our next stop is going to be Fort Fish. But of course, in order to do that, we'll need to cross the drive into the North Woods, where our next few stops are going to be. So first, we'll take these stone steps up towards the former fort. Now, Fort Fish sits at the top of a very small hill that at one point actually overlooked Harlem towards the north. So it had much more wider and much more expansive views than it does today. Now, one thing that you might notice on this map, on this topographic map, is that north of 110th Street, basically the areas just off towards the right-hand side, the land becomes much more flat, completely flat compared to the rocky hills of the Central Park area. Now, the Lenape bands that inhabited Manhattan, they called this low-lying area Muscuda, which basically translates to flat meadows in the Munsee language. So the landscape here was, as you might imagine, a little bit different. So here in Muscuda, the Lenape practiced frequent controlled burns that transformed the landscape over time. Basically, what they would do is they would get these torches and they would burn the tall grasses and the young trees of the flat valley in order to create an open grazing space that would attract deer and other large game. So this prevented the woods from taking over the area. And as such, Muscuda was one of the few spots in pre-colonial Manhattan to be open and not be defined by these dense forests. Now, when the Dutch started moving into this part of the island, they remarked on the incredible quality of the soil, which was actually fortified with nutrients released from burnt organic matter that was accumulated over the period of many, many hundreds of years. So because of this, Harlem became a very, very important agricultural center that allowed it to flourish well before the urbanization of Manhattan made its way this far north. All right, so moving on now, and a little bit further down the path, we come to this open grassy field that's right next to the woods. Now, this section of the park is usually referred to as the Wildflower Meadow, and it was restored back in the spring of 2021 when the Conservancy expanded it to include a number of plants, mostly native plants that you can find here in the state of New York. So these wildflowers, grasses, and trees, they of course grow natively in New York, and they attract important pollinators like bees, birds, and things like small mammals as well, which of course like to feast on them and spread their pollen from one plant to another, essentially allowing them to propagate out in the wild. Now, it doesn't really look all that active right now, but there's actually an explosion of life happening here at the moment. So let's go over some of these native plants and discuss how they were used by the Lenape. So first of all, one type of wild plant that's been valued for its importance, both for its healing properties as well as its ability to attract pollinators like bumblebees, is the goldenrod. It's native to the eastern woodlands of the US. So you'll sometimes see it growing along the sides of roads or perhaps maybe in unmaintained open areas. Now, native people have been, or they view the goldenrod plant as an essential healing plant because it can actually treat various ailments like fever, diarrhea, and wounds. You can also dry out the flowers and create a really nice, lovely herbal tea that relieves stress. In fact, as a testament to its healing qualities, the genus name of the goldenrod plant is Solidago, which in Latin literally translates to make whole. Now, here's another very common plant with important healing qualities known to the Lenape. This is the northern red oak. Now, we've all seen the northern red oak at some point in our lives, especially here in the park. Native folks across the land have been familiar with this tree for many generations. Now, like so many other species of oak trees, the northern red oak has these very tasty acorns that are packed with protein, and they can become edible once the outer layer has been removed. Unfortunately, it does contain a ton of tannins, which are not really very edible for humans. But once you remove the tannins, it's actually very, very healthy and really nutritious. Now, native folks sometimes made a tea from the bark, which they used for alleviating sore throats and bronchial infections. In some cases, this tea was also consumed right before certain ceremonies that required a lot of singing or chanting or just basically a lot of speaking. Now, right down the pathway, we arrive at the Ravine Waterfall up here in the North Woods. Now, I really like this area a lot because it really makes you feel like you're walking around in a pre-colonial landscape. So before Central Park and before New York City. All right, everyone, I know it's been kind of a short walk, but we are close to the end of our weekly walk now. But to kind of recap what we've learned so far, the Lenape historically have occupied the land that we now call New York for thousands of years. To them, the land was called Lenape Hoki, and it was a landscape that was heavily forested and was connected by streams, creeks, ponds, and rivers. Here in Central Park, they used the land as a hunting grounds for the food that they needed. So lots of fish, healing plants, and animals of all kinds, essentially providing them with the ample natural resources of Manhattan Island. Today, the indigenous community is still very much alive and present throughout Lenape Hoki, despite many hardships over the centuries, including disease, warfare, and forced displacement. In fact, many New Yorkers are, of course, enrolled in countless various different tribes representing descendants of not just the Lenape, but many, many other indigenous folks from throughout much of the planet. Some now prefer the name Delaware, and their historic footprint can, of course, still be found all over New York City, as in the case of the many powwows and meetings and other Native cultural events held throughout the city. Now, even though we've only just barely scratched the surface of the history and daily life of these Native groups, I do hope that you folks have learned just a little bit more about the history of Central Park as it relates to the Lenape groups. And hopefully that will kind of allow you to do a little bit more research on your own about these folks. All right, everyone, that wraps things up for today. Now, before we leave, I also wanted to promote our newest program. We do have something called the Great Hike, Arch to Arch. So on this program, we're going to hike through 4 miles of Central Park under 4 hours. And along the way, we'll talk about just some of the many historic bridges and arches dotting the landscape. So please go to our website and check it out. Tickets are available for Monday, October 9th and Saturday, October the 21st. So we're going to leave a link for you all in the chat. And again, thank you so much for everybody here. Of course, you can connect with us on our social media channels. Now, I'll be here for the next few moments in case you folks do have any questions, but otherwise, from all of us here at the Central Park Conservancy, stay safe and be well. Have a good day, folks.